I would like to propose a short critique about this approach and connect it with always the relationship between classical and intuitionistic logic. And because I really like the point of view of considering the universally pragmatic vocabularies that or practices that are pragmatically universal in order to state the point of view between different metaphysical view. And but since the approach you propose express just classical logic, doesn't I guess it entails, if we take Dumm's point of view, for example, that it is committed with realism. And is that the possibility of expressing different metaphysical view by means of pragmatically mediated relation?
Well, in this regard, I want to say that my expressivist approach to logic, and in particular the answer that I give to the demarcation question and the rejection of the correctness question, I think is entirely in line with the sort of metaphysical pluralism that I was preaching in this lecture. That is, what I say there is, stop asking the question, who's right about the conditional or the negation, the intuitionists, the classics, and so on, and instead look at what their expressive roles is, what features of material inferential practice, non-logical inferential practice, and in particular, what kind of assessment of the goodness of inference is it that's codified and made explicit by each of the different conditionals. Now, one of the things that one might discover, if Dummett is right, that is that if the only tool you've got, the only tool for achieving semantic self-consciousness that you've got is classical logic, that you're going to find yourself committed to understanding your non-logical discourse in metaphysically realist ways. Whereas, if you also have in your toolbox intuitionistic logic, you at least have the option of understanding your meanings in a more pragmatist, assertibilist sort of way, a way in which the notions of what you can mean and what you can understand are both in better harmony and more intelligible in terms of what you can actually do. So it seems to me that there's an exact parallel between the kind of pluralism that I was urging in metaphysics and the expressivist approach to logic. So it seems to me that those views mesh rather well.
Yes. In the paper you drew a distinction between global and absolute theories and local and relative. And it seems to me to understand, at least some passage, this relativity as relative to matters of pragmatic pace. And okay, the global and absolute are some metaphysical theories, at least. Once you demarcate, once you have distinguished between reasonable and not reasonable, I would say, metaphysical enterprises as you do, understanding the reasonableness of some metaphysical enterprises in a pragmatist sense, I would say, because reasonable under your understanding are those metaphysical enterprises who understand everything as as a regulative, as a regulative pragmatic principle. I was wondering, should we understand also, once you demarcate this way between reasonable and not reasonable metaphysical enterprise, should we understand these reasonable metaphysical enterprises as global and absolute theories, or should we rather understand them as global and relative ones? Because you want this reasonable metaphysics to be a pluralistic and fallibilistic one, then I assume that this being a pragmatist metaphysics that is still relative to some pragmatic choices or some pragmatic cases, so it seems rather to be a global and a relative theory.
Yeah, that's certainly the way I understand it and what I aspire to. And it's one of the things I often find that divides me from my non-pragmatist, non-inferentialist discussants is that I really do think of what I'm doing, starting with the notion of social practice, starting with normative vocabulary, thinking in terms of inference, as just one set of primitives, out of which I would like to elaborate a story about discursiveness. It's not that I think that people shouldn't be starting with some other set of primitives, with the notion of representation rather than inference, say, with an individual-based rather than a social-based account, with modal primitives rather than normative primitives, as say teleosemanticists or like Ruth Millikan do. I think those are perfectly reasonable enterprises too. There are going to be some features of discourse that are better accounted for in a social normative pragmatist inferentialist based vocabulary, and there are going to be others that are better accounted for in an atomistic representationalist and so on modal based vocabulary. And I really do believe with the young Lewis that our aim in philosophy should be a kind of understanding rather than a kind of knowledge or the achievement of truth. Hopefully we'll make some true claims and discover things along the way, but the point is understanding, and I think the stereoscopic vision that's provided by using these two base vocabularies in the enterprises in philosophy of language and philosophy generally, the stereoscopic vision that we get by using both of them brings phenomena into relief that are invisible from one or the other point of view. And I don't think there are just two of these. It should be an enterprise for us to go home and come up with 6 more such base vocabularies and just see how much of the discursive phenomena we can account for in each one. As I indicated here, every time a line is drawn, well, I can reconstruct these aspects of the phenomena, but not these others. Every time a line is drawn, it seems to me we learn something.
What I like very much is the idea that the introduction of the idea of a pragmatically mediated semantic relation is a way out, a possible way out of the stalemate we have in current approaches arguing about how to read Wittgenstein. Because on the one hand you have those who say that Wittgenstein finds some vocabulary, some way of talking deeply puzzling, and is trying to develop a theory about how to say in a less puzzling, in a less suspicious vocabulary what we seem to be saying with the suspicious and somehow dubious one. That's the constructive way of reading him. And on the other hand, we have those with Kripke being a paradigm, and on the other hand we have the McDowellian camp that says, look, he's not finding something puzzling, he's not trying to answer a question, he's not developing a theory. On the contrary, he's trying to show us that nothing has been puzzling, right? Everything is fine. And those people seem to their reason from this interpretation, they seem to be reasoning to the idea that the very attempt to say something, anything, about constructive about that original practice of ours is in vain. It's just a futile attempt. And I completely agree with the idea that this is a false choice, right? There's something in between there. We might admit that there is no ersatz way of talking for example, the vocabulary of intentionality, but still we might learn something from constructing another language, another vocabulary that is not meant to replace the original one. It's not meant to be a translation of the original one, but it's meant to be one that can say what counts as using the original one. So that's the remark. And now two questions. The two questions I would like to relate that point to two of the papers that we have heard this week. No, it wasn't a week. Well, these days. The first one is that of Danielle Macbeth, who argued, if I remember it correctly, that she still finds your approach, which that was the point of the remark, would be a Wittgensteinian project in that sense, and it's palpable that you're trying also with these crisscrossing metaphors and everything, trying to show that the project can be understood as a Wittgensteinian project. But Danielle said that she still thinks your approach is foundationalist because you stick to the idea that the algebraic understanding mode of understanding is the gold standard of understanding. And how would you react to that? I mean, what would your defense be against that reproach? And the second question concerns Eleanor's paper from this morning, and that's just an idea because I'm not familiar with the Hegel debate. It seemed to me that her way of setting up the Hegel debate is in fact quite similarly structured to the Wittgenstein debate. Right, there seemed to be a metaphysical reading and an anti-metaphysical reading, which sounded to me, but as I said, I don't know if this is correct, like an analog to the constructivist and therapeutic reading of Wittgenstein. And then your way of reading Hegel would be a middle way in that respect too. And I just wanted to ask if that is, well, if that is a good idea or just nonsense.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a methodological maxim that to the man who only has a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. And the latest, shiny new tool in my toolbox is this notion of pragmatically mediated semantic relations. And so every time now I look at some philosophical dispute, let's say between Platonist and skeptical readings within the Hegel, or between these different Wittgensteinian interpretations, and so on, I want to at least entertain the possibility of a third way that is looking at pragmatically mediated relations with it. So I think we have to be experimental about that. It's not that I have some antecedent view that this is the key that will unlock every lock, just that it's worth trying out every time we find ourselves in one of these binds. Certainly in the case of the reading of Wittgenstein, I think I found it illuminating to think of what he was doing as telling us what we need to do to say various things, where the tradition had always asked, well, what are you talking about? What are these mental states or intentional states or so on which you're representing by your talk about them? And finding various puzzles. Coming off of the Tractatus, he realized that in the Tractatus, that in the case of logical claims, that it was not helpful to think of them as representing states of affairs in the same way in which non-logical claims did. Their grammar was just different from that. And in the same way, we might say, asking how you're describing the world as being or representing the world as being when you make a probabilistic claim or a modal claim or a normative claim. Well, you can do that. You can talk about probabilistic, normative, modal states of affairs, but they're going to be puzzling. They're going to be puzzles. They're going to be funny sorts of states of affairs or facts in that case. And the later Wittgenstein's reaction to that situation, as I understand him, is to say, look, if we can describe what you need to do in order to talk this way, so that it's perfectly clear how the practice works, then there doesn't seem to be any point to puzzling about what's referred to, what's represented in this practice. Nothing is hidden if we can describe just what you need to do in order to talk this way. Now, in our own time, and actually without mentioning Wittgenstein, Hugh Price, whose very interesting work has come up several times here, has suggested that an alternative for people of a generally naturalistic bent, an alternative to traditional naturalism, which is, look, all the objects we're talking about, all the facts we're stating are ultimately the same facts that natural science is. Same objects natural science is talking about the same facts that they do. Because that's an object naturalism. And there's puzzles, again, about how normative facts could be understood that way, and so on. But another way of going is to be a subject naturalist. That is, to tell a naturalistic, anthropological story about what we discursive practitioners have to do to talk this way. And if we can tell that story in a non-puzzling way, then he doesn't think there should be anything left over that's semantically puzzling about these things. If we can be naturalists about the subjects, about us, that should be enough. Now, embarrassingly, I don't think you can actually give a naturalistic, pragmatic meta-vocabulary for these things. I think it's got to be normative. So I can't sign on to the subject naturalism that Hugh Price has, but I also don't think that a vocabulary has to be naturalistic in order not to be puzzling. I mean, an example that I discuss in the appendix to chapter 2 of Between Saying and Doing is if we imagine someone who was an indexical skeptic in the way that Quine was a modal skeptic, and says, look, I understand perfectly well ordinary non-indexical talk, but these indexicals that you use, I don't understand them. Either show me how to translate these indexical claims into non-indexical language, or agree with me that this is unintelligible and we must learn to do without it. And then if we look at the demonstration by Perry and others that there is no non-indexical way of specifying the content of indexicals, well, would we have to be skeptics? Well, not if in non-indexical vocabulary we can specify everything you need to do to use indexicals. If we can do that, surely we could say to the skeptic, what could you be puzzled about? I can describe in your favored terms, the ones you agree that you understand, everything that you need to do for you to be talking this way. If you've got some puzzle left over about that talk, that's got to be because you've got a bad picture of what you need to be able to say in order for this to be intelligible.
Yeah, I would like to go back to the Tractatus. There is this great project by Wittgenstein to finish with philosophy. So he makes logics and natural language, takes care of facts. And then there is the Tractatus itself. Of course, the solution is paradoxical. If we have followed him till there, then we throw away the letter and then there is only silence. The problem is that for Wittgenstein, as he explains to his friend Ficker, what cannot be said is what is really important. So there is another word. According to the Tractatus, we cannot talk about that, but it's the most important. There is an ethical problem there, and then there is a silence by Wittgenstein himself for a couple of decades, and then the second phase of his philosophy is quite different, as you said. Then interpretations are several, but let's say now he doesn't need this hierarchy. He just accepts the plurality of languages. And this, I think, it's an important ethical decision to respect that. So I don't understand why there is this hubris in you too to look for an universal meta-language, meta-vocabulary. Aren't languages rich enough to not to have to constrain them?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I see Wittgenstein as having learned several lessons from the Tractatus project. One is, I mean, as he tells us, he was very impressed by his other friend's remark that if you can't say it, you can't whistle it either. And I think one of his responses to that was to realize that he had this representational model of what it was to say something, and that the relation that bits of discourse stood into what they represented wasn't something he could represent in the same sense in which they represented things. This notion of projection, of sense, and so on. But he came to see that you could talk about what you need to do to institute such relations, to make something mean something else. So what he does in the later talk is do that, to describe the social practices, to talk in a pragmatic metavocabulary rather than in a semantic metavocabulary. And of course, he also became pluralistic, and instead of looking for the one grand language or form of language in which everything could be said, contented himself with looking at these local practices and what they could say and how we use those. I mean, my picture of these grand metaphysical ambitions, once they've been transposed into the key that I'm recommending, is not that we're constraining language at all. It is a pluralistic undertaking in much the same way that I think the later Wittgenstein was. That's what I meant to be getting at with the invocation of Lewis. You have to stop thinking of the metaphysical enterprise as something there's only one right way to do, and you have to stop thinking of success as being what you're aiming at in it. You are, in one sense, trying to express everything in this vocabulary, or trying to specify everything you have to do to be able to say everything. That's the local goal of it. But you're going to acknowledge there's many different ways that are equally worth trying to do that. Every one of them is going to fail. That there are going to be things that you can't express in that semantic metavocabulary. There are going to be things that you can't, in the pragmatic metavocabulary, say what you need to do in order to express. And so you have to think of each of these enterprises. It's drawing a line between the expressible and the inexpressible relative to its expressive resources. And it's by the accumulation of those different lines that we're going to learn more about what saying is than we can by just playing any one of these language games, just speaking any one of these vocabularies. So I think of myself as transposing the grand metaphysical enterprises very much into a later Wittgensteinian key. Now, it's true that one of the things he gave up, moving from the early to the later work, was precisely a commitment to confidence in the algebraic, algorithmic form of understanding as the gold standard, the one that Macbeth sees as a foundationalist remnant for me. But on that, all I can say is I'm trying to sanitize that commitment as well by acknowledging that this is not the only form of understanding. It's not the most basic form of understanding. It has to be built on the kind of hermeneutic practical understanding that Wittgenstein was principally concerned to invoke. But that nonetheless, once those concessions have been made, we can see genuine virtues to this kind of understanding, where it's available and to the extent that it's available, which the fans of classical analysis were quite right to prize. So once again, I think of myself as domesticating that appreciation and commitment by them, which they overreached. They overgeneralized. They attributed virtues to this form of understanding that we can see it doesn't have. But I don't want us to lose sight of the virtues that it does have.
Answer the question with your answer, so there's another one.
I have the question about first question is about the different reasons for which one might privilege a vocabulary as a universal vocabulary. So you portray empiricism and naturalism as two metaphysical projects that are being pursued within analytic philosophy. And you say that they privilege a certain vocabulary for different reasons, because it's more intelligible, because it's more knowable, or because it's more real. And my first question is there any limit to the possible reasons you could have for privileging vocabularies? Because you could, for instance, say a further metaphysical project would be to say, vocabulary that pleases God is privileged, and everything that can be said in or reconstructed in this vocabulary is somehow okay, and the other things are unpleasing to God. And then you could go further and say, and privilege a vocabulary because we are used to it, or I am used to it, or whatever. So my first question is there any limit to the possible reasons of privileging a vocabulary? And then I wanted to ask modal and normative vocabularies, so the two universally LX vocabularies. Do they, in virtue of being universally LX, earn a certain ontological privilege, not in the sense that everything that is real can be described in them, but maybe in the sense that they have to be very central features of what is real, so that things stand in causal relation or relations of excluding each other, and on the other hand that our practices, a central feature of our practices is that there are norms and that there are things that are normatively incompatible with one another.
Yeah, to address the second question first, I certainly mean to be arguing that there is a distinctive kind of privilege that those vocabularies have in virtue of being universally LX. They are set off from vocabularies that don't have that feature. Now, is that a sui generis kind of privilege? In a certain sense, it is. I'm saying this is the same sort of privilege that leads Kant to distinguish some concepts as pure concepts, as categories. Of course, I have a slightly different, in various ways, a different conception of it, but I say this is the same phenomenon that he was after with his theoretical apparatus. Now you ask, should that be understood as an ontological privilege? Well, it does show that there's going to be a kind of contradiction involved in someone who denies that there are possibilities, necessities, or norms. We're going to be able to refute them out of their own mouths, because as talkers, we're going to be able to show them that they are committed to the applicability of these discourses, that what's made explicit by these discourses is always implicit, just in their talking. So one is not going to be able to deny the applicability of this vocabulary, and that's one thing to mean by ontological privilege. In this regard, I think we can actually bring off, in the case of those vocabularies, and ordinary logical vocabulary, conditionals as well, in virtue of its LXness, an aspiration that we see in Kant, I think we see it again in Hegel, to underwrite the applicability of moral vocabulary by showing that what's made explicit by moral evaluations is implicit in discursive practice as such. So that if you just think about yourself as a concept user, as a judger, and think about what that involves, you'll be able to extract from that substantive moral commitments, which, as implicit in merely talking, are not optional. And this is, I think Korsgaard's reading of Kant is particularly working out this line of thought. Now, I don't know what sort of moral juice one can squeeze out of that line of thought, but the idea of that it is, in the case of normative vocabulary generally, not specifically moral, but normative vocabulary and modal vocabulary, is actually redeemed in the case that we're, well, anyway, on the line of thought of between saying and doing.
Well, I think it's done, and thanks to the speaker for his paper and also for the discussion and the time given to this workshop.